my slides today are very text heavy, which is a bit of a new thing for me. I don't usually do that, but I want to show you how I structure these prompts. But you don't need to, do screenshots and screen grabs as you're going along. You will receive all of this information, both the slides and the copy-pastable prompts as well. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. Let me do that. So let me start by explaining to you what this presentation is not. Don't expect for me to do an overly technical presentation here, sharing things like automation, AI automation tools like N8 workflows. These are definitely useful when we're talking about scaling AI processes. And I've seen some amazing stuff that people much smarter and much more technically savvy than me can do with automation tools like N8N. And if you haven't tested this out for yourself, do give these tools a go. I think they can be pretty helpful for specific tasks that you have. But what I've seen in my work with AI is that when we're trying to create new tools with AI, we routinely fall within that common automation trap. And this is from my all-time favorite comics called XKCD. So what he stipulates is that we think that when we start automating a task with code, in our case with an AI tool, we'll have a quick jump of the work we need to do at the start, but then the work will automatically be reduced by a significant margin. And in fact, what happens is that you're adding on top not just your standard work, but also the maintenance of these AI tools. So in my use cases, and I'm going to say in most content-related use cases, I've seen that simpler is almost always better, because it's much easier to update and to change a single custom GPT or Claude project than it is to update a mastodon like that and figure out what isn't working anymore or what needs to change. So that's why I say let's stick with simpler flows when we are first starting to automate, because this allows us two things. On the one hand side, it allows us to test how we've structured our AI tool. For example, if the prompt is detailed enough, if the steps are clear enough for the AI to follow, and so on. And then you can quickly fix things that are not working, test it out for a couple of weeks in a simpler format like a custom GPT, and then move on to a more complex automation if you need it. I'm gonna say for the projects I've been working on over the past 9 to 12 months, we have very rarely seen situations where we need something like this. So that's why I'm going to talk to you about mainly setting repeatable workflows in custom GPTs or Claude projects or Gemini gems. Whatever you're using, it's totally fine. The same principles apply. So the first thing that I think you need to start with when you're trying to figure out how you can scale content creation with AI is to define the flows that you would benefit from automation in. So this is what I would generally start with. Before this step, before actually jumping into Claude or ChatGPT or whatever, whichever your favorite tool is, what I would do before that would be to very clearly define my content production flow. And this can be done in a simple text format. It can be done in more of a visual, like a diagram or something like that. Or another very simple way of doing it would be to talk directly to the AI and explain in your own words what's the process that you're following to create your standard content formats. This may differ by content type. In this specific example, I'm stipulating that we have a single content production process, and that's that. What I start with here is a little bit of role play. And I've seen some people say that with newer models, you don't necessarily need to give the AI a role. I still find that when I give my AI a role, it works better than if I don't do that at all. So that first paragraph here serves the purpose of giving the AI a set of words and phrases that will sort of direct it at the context of what we will be doing here. So I start with saying you're going to be an experienced prompt engineer. You're going to be working as an LLM collaboration expert. You know how to get the most out of ChatGPT, Claude, and other models. And then I tell it you're familiar with. And the only reason for that final sentence in here to exist is to give it more jargon that's related to what I'm going to ask it to do later on, just to give it an understanding of what's the direction where I want to sort of focus the AI's attention. As you all probably know, AI is essentially just a very complex statistical model. So the more words I give it at the start that are related to the context that I'm trying to talk about, the better it will be to retrieve additional information that's related to that context. Then what I do is I tell it shortly what we'll be working on today. So we'll be trying to integrate AI into our content production process. And I've masked here the name of the client that I was working for when I used this specific prompt, but this is generally like a very similar variation is where I would generally start with most of my clients. And then I give it a couple of questions to answer in the end. And this is an approach called priming representation. And I've done another AI workshop a couple of months ago, actually more than a couple, it was back in November, but the content there still holds the test of time, which is awesome. And you can watch it here to learn more about priming or creating this priming representation technique that I'm using here. But essentially what I'm trying to do is ask it a couple of questions that are related to what we will be doing together, just to make it create this additional web of context that will help it with further tasks. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this because this is something that I think by now is quite popular with people who are using AI day to day. If you want to learn more about priming representations, you can click the link here when you get the slides and watch our previous live, and you'll learn a lot more about it there. And in the AI library that I'll be sharing with you today, there is a link to an excellent article about priming representation that you can also check out and learn quickly what it is. But suffice to say, when I give this task to the AI, it returns a very long explanation of LLM collaboration principles and how to integrate AI better and so on and so forth. The only purpose that serves is to see that it's clear on the context that we're talking about here. And the next step is where it sort of gets interesting. This is where I would give it my content production process. I usually just attach it as a file. So what I've done in this case is attached a content production process with the checklists that we use to define what needs to happen at each step of our process. And then I ask it to create or rather highlight the different steps in this process where we could implement AI. This helps me uncover additional opportunities that I might not have thought of when I was first starting to create this AI integration project. So it will help you see a ton of different opportunities. Some of them will not be applicable at all in your case, and that's totally fine. What you want to see are the ones that actually make sense for you. I give it a lot of directions on the output that I want to get and what format I want it in, because AI, when left to its own devices, usually returns very wordy replies unless you specifically direct it not to. So I usually give it an idea of, okay, like split your answer by the stages that we use in our content production process. Create this as a condensed reply, so don't add a ton of gibberish text, make it a bullet point list, and so on and so forth. So it's clear on what I want to get out of it. And then what I usually add to this when I review the different suggestions that it had, and I tell it, oh, I'd love to use these few AI automations. I don't really want to focus on these other few that you've suggested. These don't work for our case specifically, or whatever it is. So in the end, what I ask it to add are the training materials. So what external knowledge or company resources the AI would need to make these tools work, and this can be anything from for example, frameworks for content repurposing. So that falls under external knowledge. Like, what are the principles for zero-click content? This still falls under external knowledge, so that I can make sure that both me and the AI are on the same page as to what constitutes good content repurposing. Or in the company resources side, it could be stuff like your brand voice guidelines, or your messaging pillars, whatever it is that will make the AI tool work better. For any case of content creation, I would at minimum add a certain number of knowledge blocks. I'll talk about knowledge blocks in a second here. But these are different resources that the AI tool needs to take into account when creating its output. So this is the first bit, the training materials. The second bit is the input. So what will a person using the tool need to add to the tool in order to make it work? And then the output. So what would the tool return as an end result? One framework that I really like for uncovering content automation opportunities is a framework called TRIPS. And this is designed by Trust Insights. I can't recommend enough their content that's related to AI implementation in marketing use cases. You definitely need to check it out. But essentially, TRIPS stands for Time, Repetition, Importance, Pain, and Sufficient Data. This will help you uncover processes that you can automate. You start with time. So what are the tasks that consume a lot of time that you could potentially automate? You continue with repetition. How often do you do each of these individual tasks? If it's something that you do only once per quarter, maybe that's not the best place to start. Importance, how important is the task, or how much risk is there if it doesn't really work as well as you expect it to. The higher the importance, the more you'd want to include humans in the loop, a person who actually checks the output of the AI before you produce any of that. The pain of the task, meaning is this something that is really draining the energy from you or from your content team? And then finally, sufficient data. If you have examples that you can provide to the AI, if you have existing content that you can give it, or specific information that it can take into account to produce a better quality output, then this might be a good candidate for AI automation. If this is something completely new as a type of initiative for your team, I would generally advise you to first go through it a couple of times without any substantial AI support, just to see what the process is before you start thinking about implementation of AI automations in there, because you still don't know what's going on, and that means you can't really automate it unless you have a very clear understanding of the process. Let's say we know what are the different flows that we're trying to automate. One thing that I've done in the past that I would now classify as a mistake is to use a single project for all of your writing needs, as opposed to creating discrete tools for discrete tasks. So this is something I've done in the past. I had a project in Claude that I was using for all my writing. Newsletter, articles, social media posts, blog posts, whatever it is, I would just jump into that project. Obviously, it had training on my existing writing and brand voice and some general writing guidelines, but it was, in the broadest sense, a writing supporter. And this isn't the best way of doing things for two reasons. First off, the broader you go, the lower the quality of the output of your AI would be. And second, if you have a broad project like that, every time you start a new chat with the AI, every time you give it a new task, you will need to remind it what's the specific type of content that you're creating now and what are the requirements for that. For example, at minimum, what's the length of the piece? How should it be structured? What would be, I don't know, specific do's and don'ts that relate to that content format? What I've started doing, and I have to say it works way better, is creating individual projects or custom GPTs or Gemini gems for specific tasks. So in this example here on the right, that's my Claude project for newsletter writing. And this project has examples of my existing newsletter editorials. It has brand guidelines specifically developed for newsletter writing. It has writing best practices that have to do fully with newsletter writing and nothing else. And the jump I've seen in the speed with which I create new pieces and in the initial output quality of the AI, it has been substantial. So I would advise you, for every individual content type you create, you would set up an individual project, or even going a step further, for each individual step of your content production process, you can set up an individual project, meaning that you have one project specifically for drafting and editing blog posts, and then you have a different project for generating repurposing ideas of these individual blog posts. This allows the AI to really know what it needs to give you as output, and it also ensures that even if this one time you created a blog post fully on your own without the help of AI, or someone else on your team prefers to use a different tool to create their writing, then you can feed any content draft into your repurposing tool and it will return the same type of results. Splitting tasks in individual projects does add a couple of steps to the process, because when the draft is ready, you need to copy that, add it to a Google Doc or whatever, and then you need to feed that Google Doc into your repurposing planner to think about some ideas on how you can repurpose that individual blog post. But I think that the upside of the quality of the results more than makes up for these additional steps that you need to make. Let's go through the step-by-step of creating an individual tool like that. And throughout this example, I'll be using my Marketing Matters newsletter. If you're not subscribed to my newsletter, then you can do that and see what's the real-life example of content produced with AI following these steps, because that's what I use to create my weekly posts. Here's how I go about this. The first thing that I do is I never try to start with a blank page, or rather just with best practices. I don't really enjoy, getting recommendations based on what's the way other people do things. So I always try to start with existing content that I have. So what you see here is that I've added to this conversation, a file called newsletter signature content. This file includes about 30 individual newsletter editorial pieces from my existing content that I think represent my style well and that were done over the past year and a half. So this is recent content and content that I think represents the type of stuff I want to create. You don't really need as many as 30 examples. If you have them, then that's awesome. But if not, you can just give it 4 or 5 individual blog posts or like 20 LinkedIn posts or whatever, depending on like the specific use case you're trying to solve here. So I give it the signature content and I tell it, I want you to analyze the following document. I tell it what that document contains. This specific document is very well formatted, so I know that it will be easy enough for the AI to figure out what's in there. If I wasn't 100% sure, I would add here some notes on the formatting of the file. So for example, if it's a CSV file or a table, I'd say in column A you'll find X, in column B you'll find Y, just to make sure that it understands correctly what I'm giving it and it can then jump into analyzing that content well. So I then tell it, I want you to, based on that signature content, I want you to create a brand voice guideline and content structure directions that will result in pieces similar to these originals. I could very well give it my existing brand voice guidelines because I have that readily available because I'm a marketer. I've done my research. I have predefined brand voice guidelines. But I choose not to because I would want to see what it comes up with. I can always, as a next step, clarify or give it additional directions if I see that it doesn't fully represent my brand voice guideline as I want it to. But in most cases, I see that AI is very good at pattern recognition. So as long as you've created content that's consistently similar in style, in structure, in the type of language you use, in even the topics and themes, then the AI would have no trouble understanding what's in there. So when I give it that, I would get as a reply from that something like that. So here's Vasilena's voice and content guidelines. Here are the core voice characteristics. And this is just like a very small subset of the output of the AI. Really cool thing that you can do then is just either copy that text and paste it in a file, or if you're using Claude, you can directly download it as Markdown. I'll talk about Markdown as a format in a second, but suffice to say, this is the most efficient and easily readable for a human and an AI as well format that you can use. If you're doing that in ChatGPT, you can ask it to structure its output in Markdown format. It really well knows what Markdown is, and it will give you a copy-pastable section that you can then use for reference in your content AI tool that you'll be using in the long run. So when you see these characteristics, think about if there's anything missing, if something is not quite right, if it requires more strict, directions on your brand voice and so on and so forth. But you end up with a pretty thorough explanation of what your brand voice is and then what the structure of your original content is. I'll show you in a second the final result of this. Well, more than a second because we still have a while to go through. But I'll show you how it's created the content structure directions, and you'll see, if you're familiar with my newsletter, that it pretty much nailed it without a lot of input on my end. So it's a great example that this process works. The reason we are creating this brand voice guideline, and anything you create further down, like the content structure directions or any additional resources, is that we want to create a library of what I call knowledge blocks. These are individual useful assets that you can use in content production that you can add to new projects to streamline the way you create content with AI. So some examples of such knowledge blocks that you'd want to have at your disposal. First off, a short company overview, and by short I mean a couple of pages of text describing your company, your industry, the products that you have, your value proposition, and so on and so forth. So a short, simple way of telling the AI, this is our brand, this is what we do. Audience personas, and these personas should include details that facilitate your content decisions. I'll show you an example of that in a second. Any guidelines that you want to reuse, either for an individual AI tool like a newsletter AI creator, or across the board for different content creation tasks like a brand voice guideline. That might be something you can use in your blog post editor, in your newsletter creator, in your LinkedIn content creator, and so on and so forth. Any existing content that the AI can learn from, what I called signature content pieces in the previous step. So trying to give the AI enough examples, but don't overwhelm it. If you have 200 blog posts on your website, choose 20 or 10 that really represent your writing style and what you want to create to give it a clear idea of what you're aiming for. And finally, something that's very common in academia that I'll talk about in a little bit, called a scoring rubric. And this is an additional, think of it almost as a checklist that the AI tool can use for self-assessment. And these scoring rubrics will be individual for each AI tool that you create. And I definitely advise you to create this self-assessment loop at the end of the prompt for your AI tool, because it helps the AI return back to the original criteria for quality content that you set and make sure that its output matches these criteria. So all of these generally would be individual assets that you add to either a custom GPT or a Claude project to let it learn from existing resources. And I mentioned earlier Markdown, and here's a very clear example of why I prefer Markdown format to including a Google Doc or a Word document to the AI. These two files, they are completely the same. The content inside them is the same. These 30-ish newsletter editorial pieces that I mentioned earlier. The doc file, the Word document, is 700 kilobytes, and the Markdown with these same content pieces is just 100 kilobytes. All of those additional 600 kilobytes are just formatting fluff that the AI doesn't need to understand your content. It lowers the time that the AI needs to reference back these original materials and return an answer to you. So it also saves you time. Let's see if there's anything in the chat here. So I see a comment here, my custom GPT doesn't check back my writing style and keeps writing in its style, and when I call it out, it accepts, apologizes, but again goes back to using its own writing style. I have to say, if you structure the steps that the AI needs to go through and you specifically reference back the writing style, I tend to see that the AI gets better at doing that. So this would be one piece of advice. If you structure the prompt in the way that I'm about to show you, it will be easier for AI to know, oh, this additional resources is the writing style, I need to reference it every time, and so on and so forth. And then the other component of that will be the final step of self-assessment. So I'll show you how to add that step to your AI tools to make sure that, both you and the AI are checking against the same set of criteria. Okay, moving on to the next step. And it's about a very common issue that we see, which is that AI, as we were just talking, tends to write in its own style and favors specific phrases. We've all heard about delve into, or in the fast-paced world of whatever, and so on and so forth. So whenever you're using AI for writing, I would suggest you give it a blacklist of phrases that you definitely don't want it to use, and you keep updating that blacklist with new phrases as they come up, because they almost always will come up again and again in the writing. The thing that you see on the screenshot here is an awesome resource that you also have linked in the slides. Cool guy called Sam Peach. He created this very long collection of phrases and individual words that the AI routinely overuses, and he calls it the anti-slop sampler, meaning that you can use these lists as individual blacklists, so you don't allow your AI to use any of them. What I try to do, because both of these lists that he has are quite long, they're about 2,000 lines each. So what I try to do, rather than just use these on their own, is when I give the AI my signature content, I ask it a simple question, and it is based on what you see in my signature content and based on what you know to be some of the most common phrases AI models tend to use. You could, before asking that question, include these two files from Sam Peach's list to the AI so it would know specifically what phrases you're talking about, or just leave it in general, because I feel that when asked point blank, the AI really knows what are these phrases that it's overusing. And then you tell it to create a list of cliched phrases you'd never like to see in your particular content type. This returns a list of cliches that you can use as an additional knowledge block in your content, just as you would use your brand voice guideline as something the AI needs to strive to stick with. You would include an AI cliche blacklist to tell it, I definitely don't want to use that. And you reference that in your master prompt of your AI tool. And then the other component that I mentioned earlier that I want to talk about again is a scoring rubric. So this is essentially a very simple list of criteria that you want the AI to self-assess its work against, and to give you a clear assessment of how closely it followed your existing directions and your guidelines. A scoring rubric is something that's often used in academia, and since most LLM models were first trained on research papers and academic papers, AIs really tend to understand scoring rubrics really, really well. So when you say the word scoring rubric, even if you yourself have never created one, the AI will know exactly what you're talking about. So I tell it, I want you to create a scoring rubric that will help us assess the output that you create against the style and signature patterns from my newsletter or whatever content it is you're trying to create. This will return something like this. So this is my content scoring rubric. It's a set of criteria, all making up a total of 100 points that the AI uses to assess its output. So in this example, the first section is voice authenticity, how closely we're following the brand voice guidelines. It's 25 points in total that you can get for this section. And then it explains like how many points are given for each individual type of content output that it has created. So this is the final component. And when you have a scoring rubric, you can either reference it directly, meaning that you can ask the AI, hey, here's a draft piece of content that I've done on my own. Can you assess it against my scoring rubric and tell me what I can improve? Or you can add it in a master prompt like the ones I'm going to show you, to include a self-assessment loop. A self-assessment loop is a really strong way of improving the content output without you having to do the asking and poking and prodding, and the AI does it on its own. So a self-assessment loop very simply means adding an additional step after your AI writes your content for you. And in that step, it will turn back to the scoring rubric. It will assess the content that it has created against it and then try to improve it to achieve 100 points and return back an improved version for you to then review, rather than just reviewing the initial draft that might be further away from what you're trying to do. So scoring rubrics is also something that I covered in detail in my previous workshop of the Prompt to Perfect Now series, I guess, because this is the second edition. So you can access the original here, and in your AI content library that I'll send you with the recording and the additional materials, you'll see an article talking about scoring rubrics and how they can be used for content creation. So now that we have the individual components for our AI tool, we want to create the master prompt. And the master prompt is really the set of instructions you want to give the AI to perform the tasks that you want it to create. Usually, this is the set of components I use in a master prompt. First, I ask it to perform its job in a particular role that I give it. This can be as simple as you're a ghostwriter for executive content creators or whatever. It can be more complex as you're a content writer that's also familiar with outdoor storage solutions and internal design practices. If you're creating content for like an outdoor architecture magazine or whatever, it can be whatever makes sense in your case. This role should be just a couple of lines long, telling the AI, you're this guy and you're going to be doing this particular type of task. Then the next section is the goal. And this is really about telling the AI, this is what we're trying to achieve here. Not just we're trying to write a newsletter piece, but we're trying to write a newsletter piece that covers this set of criteria. And then we give it some constraints. We're telling it basic stuff that AIs tend to forget, like don't hallucinate, don't add any statistics or customer quotes that were not in the original content that I've provided for you. Don't invent any personal stories that I didn't specifically share or whatever makes sense. And then you also tell it what it wants to do. Do create a single piece of writing that's 400 to 600 words or whatever. So you're essentially giving it the do's and don'ts right off the bat. Then you're going to mention the external knowledge assets. So these knowledge blocks that I've been talking about so far, these will be the assets that the AI will be able to reference in its work to create better output. In my case, with the example I was giving you, it's the brand voice guideline, the signature content examples, and the newsletter scoring rubric. And finally, you want it to have a step-by-step guidance on what needs to happen. So this is very simply put, who does what. As an example, the first step is the user needs to give you directions on the content idea. If they don't cover these individual components, ask them follow-up questions in order to create that, and so on and so forth. So let me just jump quickly into showing you what this actually looks like. What you see here is the marketing matters knowledge block. So this is everything that I've created to put into my Claude project for newsletter writing to include here. So we have the AI clichés blacklist that I mentioned already. I have an audience guide here, which I created. Let me just pull that up real quickly and I'll actually show you how I created that. I gave the AI a set of directions from my original persona research. So I have with me a PDF with personas and empathy maps that I've created for my own work. So these are all the three main personas that I traditionally serve. I have done the upfront work of figuring out who these people are, creating the personas. So in this case, I gave it this PDF and I told it I want to create a short description of these audiences in a simplified text version, because this is the simplest way I can include that in AI. So here's the final output after I did some corrections to it, and it has my persona with a short profile overview, their core pain points, their jobs to be done, and then information about all the other personas. So this is actually what a person would see if they open up this knowledge block with audience guidelines. Then I have the newsletter signature content that I already spoke about, and this is, as you can see, the biggest piece because it's 30 individual content pieces, so that makes sense that its size is significantly bigger than the other ones. We have the newsletter scoring rubric and the voice guide. Just to show you the scoring rubric in more detail, that's what it looks like. You have voice authenticity as a first step, you have the content structure as a second step, substance and value, so the quality of the content itself, audience connection, how well my content relates to these three audience personas that I just presented, writing craft, meaning how well is it written from a copywriting perspective, and that's how you get the final score. And also we have, let me see if I can, yeah, there we go, that's better. What we have here in the end is red flags that are actually deducting points from the total. And as you can see here, this is using any phrase from the AI clichés blacklist is giving it -5 points. So the AI is really incentivized to not include any words and phrases that are already present in that file. So this is just an example of what that looks like, because I assume not all of you are familiar with scoring rubrics. And now to show you how everything is put together, this is the master newsletter prompt that I just shared about. Here's the role. You are an expert ghostwriter specializing in thought leadership, etc., etc. This is the content of Vasi that you'll be creating. Here's the section about goals, and it doesn't just have the short explanation here, it has success indicators. So what does quality content mean to me? It has quality benchmarks, meaning what's the general structure, should we include examples or not, so on and so forth. Then we have the constraints, what you must do, from writing from first person, not just highlighting theoretical knowledge, but practical knowledge, etc., etc. What it must not do, chief among them, avoid cliches, and so on and so forth. Then the next section is about the external knowledge assets. So everything that I will be adding to this project is mentioned here, so the AI can fully orient itself into how it should use these reference files and these additional resources. And then the instructions that go step by step. So this is sort of the structure that I would use for most content creation tasks. I would first start off by getting the AI to ask me about the broader idea that I want to cover in this particular piece. I would then ask it to analyze if it has enough information to create the content, and if not, challenge me and ask additional questions for clarification. Then it will plan the content according to the structure that I've given it for my individual content pieces. It will give me an outline that I need to check and confirm as a human reviewer. Then it will create its draft. Then it will do its self-assessment using the rubric that I presented. And then finally, it will polish it with some general, writing guidelines that will make for more readable content. Finally, I've added in here a step about title generation. because that's the most important bit, so I'm leaving it as last. And then just a general guideline on what format I want the output in. And here's what that looks like. So this is a recent newsletter edition that I created. What I've done first, and the reason you see this as no direction from me at all, but just a pasted piece, is that I spoke to the AI directly and I tried to tell it what I'm thinking about as this week's newsletter editorial. I'm very big on talking to AI, so you should definitely try that. ChatGPT already allows you to do that from both desktop and mobile. Claude allows you to use voice in AI only on the mobile app. So if you don't see it in desktop, that's why. And then basically what happened next is following that structured process that I mentioned. It's telling me, here's what I plan to do. Here are the questions that I have for you. I answered those questions in a couple of sentences. Then it gave me an outline that I reviewed. In this case, I told it that this looks great. In some other cases, like in this case, for example, I told it that I'm not sure about the hook and I'd like it to explore a different type of hook. So it amended the outline and so on. Then I tell it to draft the content. I have the output of the content as I mentioned it earlier, which is 5 title options at the top and then the rest of the editorial piece. With something like that, with a process like that, I generally have probably like another 30 minutes to an hour to make sure that this is actually something that I'd consider worthy of sending to my newsletter list. So it saves me a lot of time in creating all of that, because up to this point, I have invested like all the thinking time beforehand, obviously, but I've only invested a couple of minutes to talk to the AI and create this sort of unstructured gibberish explanation of what I wanted to do. So this is sort of the general process of going through all of this. You can set this up as a Claude project or as a custom GPT. I haven't included here an example with Gemini, but the process would generally be the same. The Claude project looks something like this. So I have here in the project knowledge section, I have project instructions, which is that master prompt. And then all the additional materials are put in here as Markdown files for the AI to review. I also have that same setup created in a custom GPT. Frankly, I don't use ChatGPT for writing. I very much prefer Claude's output, but I just did that to show you how you can set this up really quickly. When you create a GPT, you just include, the title and a short description that shows up on the public facing side. Then you add the instructions, and this is where I added my full master prompt. And then I've added in the knowledge section all of the individual additional assets that it has as external knowledge blocks. And this is like a very simple setup that you can then share with your team. I can theoretically use this to share with someone if I wanted other people to create content like mine. I'm still keeping it as an only me type of project, so you won't be able to create my next newsletter editorial. But that's the general setup that I'm using. So let me check out if there are some questions in here. I see one question that I'm gonna answer, and in the meantime, if there's anything you want to ask about this process, then go ahead. I'll stay for a bit to make sure that everything is actually answered. So the question here is, what if I'm helping a client with scaling their content, but they don't have any knowledge documents? Should they hire a copywriter to get started getting that together, or can something else be done? You can, in general, do it yourself or do it together with the client. I don't think that you definitely need to involve an external copywriter to do all of that, but maybe if they have an in-house person, they might help you collect all of these different components together. There's a very simple and powerful technique that you can use when you're creating these. First off, obviously, you need to list all the knowledge blocks that you want created. So, for example, if you know that it will be important for the AI to consider your audience's needs, which it obviously is something that you need to do, then you'd want to have some short explanation about the audience and the pain points that you're solving with your individual content pieces. When you have identified this need, what you can do is create a priming representation. So talk to the AI and ask it a couple of questions first, saying, hey, like, what's a good setup for an audience persona if I'm going to be using it to decide if my content fits that audience or not? What are some common audience research criteria that people use when creating audience personas? What are some lesser known tips for creating audience personas? What are some questions that people would ask? So in that way, you add additional context that the AI can first give you upfront, and then it can reference within that same chat. And what you can do is tell it, okay, I'm trying to create audience personas for this and that project. Ask me questions one at a time until you have enough information to create a clear audience persona profile that we can then use for content creation decision making. And then what will happen is the AI will start asking you questions, and obviously you're sitting there together with your client and you guys are answering these questions. Maybe you'd want to turn back and answer at a later time because you don't have the information available up front. But in any case, what you're going to end up with is almost like a directed interview done by AI for your, in this case, audience personas or any other of the knowledge blocks that you would need to have at your disposal to do this. And then you can just simply copy and paste the output and use that as your knowledge block. So this is a simplified process that you can use when you don't have that information available, but it is still stored within the brain of your client or of your team if you're working with an existing organization as an in-house marketer. So hope that sort of solves that particular pain point. I see some people saying that this was helpful. I'm very happy to hear that. So that's awesome. Thank you everyone so much for being here, for giving me your time and attention. Within a couple of days, I'm going to send you a link to the recording and to all of the additional materials, both the slides of that presentation and a short prompt library with everything that I showed you today with some examples. And if there's anything else that comes up as you're creating tools for scaling your content production with AI, then send them my way and I'll be more than happy to answer. So that's it from me. Have a great rest of your day and happy content creation to all of you.